I never believed in the kind of love that sneaks up on you slowly, the kind that grows like wildflowers in the cracks of concrete. I thought love was supposed to announce itself, bold and obvious. But then Marcus started working at my apartment complex, and everything I thought I knew about falling in love turned out to be wrong. It was late March when I first noticed him. I'd been living in that building for 2 years, working from home as a freelance graphic designer, spending most of my days staring at screens and forgetting what fresh air felt like. My apartment was on the second floor, corner unit, with windows that overlooked the courtyard garden that had been neglected for years. The previous groundskeeper had been this elderly man who mostly just mowed the lawn twice a month and called it a day. Marcus was different from the moment he arrived. I remember looking out my window one morning, coffee in hand, and seeing him standing in the middle of the courtyard with his hands on his hips, surveying the space like an artist examining a blank canvas. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark skin that caught the morning light, and he wore these work clothes that somehow looked intentional, like he'd chosen them carefully. His hair was cut close, and even from my window, I could see the concentration on his face as he walked the perimeter of the garden, occasionally crouching down to examine the soil or touch a struggling plant. I didn't think much of it that first day, just another worker doing his job. But then I started noticing him every morning. He'd arrive around 7 before most of the building was awake, and he'd work steadily until early afternoon. I found myself timing my morning coffee to coincide with his arrival. I told myself it was coincidence that I just happened to wake up earlier these days. The first real change I noticed was the roses. There was this sad rose bush near the building entrance that had been dying for as long as I'd lived there, brown and brittle, more thorns than flowers. Within 2 weeks of Marcus starting, that rose bush was thriving. Deep red blooms opened up like they'd been waiting years for someone to care. I watched him tend to it one morning, his hands gentle as he pruned away the dead growth, and I felt something strange in my chest. Envy, maybe, or longing. Wishing someone would look at me with that kind of careful attention. I'm not someone who falls easily. I'd had relationships before, a few serious ones, but nothing that lasted. I'd convinced myself I was too focused on my career, too independent, too comfortable with solitude. My last boyfriend had told me I was emotionally unavailable, and I hadn't really disagreed. I liked my life neat and controlled. Feelings complicated things, but there was something about watching Marcus work that felt meditative. He moved through the garden with purpose, but without rush, like he had all the time in the world. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring out the window for 20 minutes, watching him dig or plant or water, my work completely forgotten. My friends started joking that I was becoming a hermit. They didn't know I was spending my mornings watching the Groundskeeper, like he was my own personal nature documentary. The pansies appeared in mid-April. I woke up one morning, stumbled to the window with my eyes barely open, and there they were. A whole bed of pansies planted directly beneath my window, in this corner of the courtyard that had been nothing but weeds and bare dirt. Purple and yellow and white, their little faces turned up toward the sun, toward my window. I stood there for a long time, coffee getting cold in my hand, staring at those flowers. It had to be coincidence. Marcus was renovating the whole garden. Of course, he'd plant flowers under the windows. That's what groundskeepers did. But pansies were my favorite flower, had been since I was a kid, and my grandmother grew them in her garden. I'd never told anyone in the building that. I'd never told anyone in this city that. I watched Marcus that morning more carefully than usual. He was working on the other side of the courtyard, installing a new trellis, but a few times I caught him glancing toward my window. Or maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I wanted to imagine it. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I went downstairs. My heart was pounding like I was about to give a presentation, to a room full of strangers. I told myself I was just going to check my mailbox, maybe take a walk around the courtyard. Casual, normal. Not at all because I wanted to see the man who might have planted my favorite flowers where I'd see them every morning. He was kneeling by a flower bed, his back to me, digging with a hand trowel. I stood there like an idiot, trying to figure out what to say. Thank you for the flowers felt presumptuous. Nice work on the garden was too generic. Before I could decide, he turned around, and our eyes met for the first time. His eyes were brown, deep and warm, with these flecks of gold that caught the light. He had dirt on his cheek and a surprised expression that quickly shifted into something softer, a smile. Small but genuine. "Morning," he said. His voice was deeper than I expected, with a slight rasp to it. "Morning," I managed. "The garden looks amazing. You've done incredible work." He glanced around, that small smile still on his face. "Thanks, it's getting there. Previous guy let it go pretty bad, but the soil's good. Everything was just waiting for a little attention." "The pansies are beautiful," I said, and immediately felt my face heat up. Too specific, too revealing, but his smile widened. "Yeah? I wasn't sure about those. Pansies can be tricky this time of year, but they seemed right for that spot." "They're my favorite," I said, and the words came out quieter than I intended. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or satisfaction. "Good to know," he said. We stood there for a moment, the morning sun warming my shoulders, the smell of fresh earth and growing things all around us. I should have said something else, extended the conversation, but my throat felt tight and my mind was blank. So I just nodded, gave him what I hoped was a normal smile, and walked away feeling like I'd just failed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. But I went down the next morning too, and the morning after that. Each time we'd exchange a few words, nothing deep, just comments about the weather or the garden or the building, but each conversation lasted a little longer. I learned his name was Marcus, that he'd been doing landscaping for 5 years, that he'd moved to the city from a small town upstate. He learned I was a designer, that I worked from home, that I drank way too much coffee. "I noticed," he said one morning, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "You're at that window every morning with a mug. I was starting to think you were keeping watch." I felt my face flush. "Just enjoying the view," I said. "The garden view, I mean, since you fixed it up." "Right," he said, and there was something in his tone, something playful and knowing that made my stomach flip. The lavender came next, a whole row of it planted along the path that led to my building entrance. I'd mentioned once, casually, that I loved the smell of lavender, that it reminded me of this trip I'd taken to France years ago. I'd barely thought about it after saying it, just one of those throwaway comments you make in small talk. But there it was, lavender, young plants but already fragrant, placed exactly where I'd walk past them every time I left my apartment. That evening, I caught him as he was packing up his tools. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and amber, and he looked tired but content, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands stained with soil. "Marcus," I called out, my heart hammering. He turned, his face brightening when he saw me. "Hey, thought you only came out in the mornings." "I wanted to ask you something," I said, walking closer. "The lavender and the pansies. Did you—" I trailed off, suddenly unsure how to finish that sentence without sounding presumptuous or crazy. He set down his tool bag and looked at me directly, his expression serious now. "I planted them for you," he said simply. "I know it might seem weird, but I listen when you talk. You mentioned pansies were your favorite, and the lavender, and I thought you might like to see them when you looked out your window, or smell them when you walked past." My throat felt tight. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching my face. Because I like the way you look at the garden, he finally said. Like it matters, like beauty matters. Most people in this building walk past without seeing any of it. But you notice, you care. And I wanted to make something that was just for you. I didn't know what to say. No one had ever done anything like that for me before. No grand gestures, no expensive gifts, just attention. Real, genuine attention to the small things that made me who I was. I started, and my voice cracked. That's the kindest thing anyone's ever done for me. His expression softened. It's just flowers. It's not just flowers, I said. It's you seeing me, really seeing me. We stood there in the fading light, the smell of lavender drifting around us, and something shifted. The air felt heavier, charged with possibility. I wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to close the distance between us, but I was terrified. Terrified of misreading the moment, of ruining whatever this was. I should let you go, he said quietly. It's getting late. Wait, I said, the word coming out more desperate than I intended. Do you want to get coffee sometime, or dinner? I mean, if you're interested in me. I think you might be based on the flowers, but maybe I'm reading this all wrong, and if I am, just forget I said anything, and I'm interested, he interrupted, and his smile was like sunrise. I've been interested since the first morning I saw you at your window, looking down at this disaster of a garden like you were trying to will it back to life with your mind. I laughed, relief flooding through me. I thought I was being subtle. You were. I'm just observant. Occupational hazard. We got coffee that weekend at this little place downtown that served overpriced lattes and had mismatched furniture that somehow worked. We talked for 3 hours until they started stacking chairs around us as a hint. I learned that Marcus had studied environmental science in college but couldn't afford to finish, that he'd learned landscaping from his grandfather, that he wanted to eventually start his own landscape design business. He learned that I'd come out to my family at 19, and they'd been supportive but distant ever since, that I'd moved to the city to escape a small town that felt suffocating, that I was terrified of letting people get close because everyone I'd ever loved had eventually left. I'm not good at this, I told him, as we walked back toward my apartment, the spring evening cool and clear, at being vulnerable, at letting someone in. My ex was right when he said I was emotionally unavailable. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his hands in his pockets, his shoulder occasionally brushing mine as we walked. You know what I've learned from working with plants, he finally said. Some things need time. You can't force a seed to grow faster than it's ready to. You just have to create the right conditions and be patient. Are you comparing me to a plant? He laughed. Maybe. Is that weird? A little. But I like it. We started seeing each other regularly after that. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates, which turned into long walks through the city, which turned into him coming up to my apartment and staying until midnight, talking about everything and nothing. I learned the way he liked his tea, the fact that he was obsessed with old jazz records, that he had a younger sister he called every Sunday without fail. He learned that I was a terrible cook but excellent at ordering takeout, that I had a collection of vintage design books I'd been accumulating since college, that I hummed when I was concentrating on work. The garden continued to transform. Every week brought something new. Climbing roses on the trellis, a small herb garden near the building entrance, a bench positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon sun. But there were still new additions outside my window. Forget-me-nots in May, their tiny blue flowers like scattered pieces of sky. Snapdragons in June, tall and vibrant, swaying in the breeze. You're spoiling me, I told him one morning as we sat together on the bench he'd installed, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. Good, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. You deserve to be spoiled. I'm serious, though. You don't have to keep planting things for me. I'm all ready. I trailed off, the words catching in my throat. Already what? He prompted gently. Already falling for you? I finished quietly. Pretty hard, actually. I felt him tense slightly, then relax. His arm tightened around me. Good, he said again. Because I'm already there. Have been for a while. It wasn't perfect. I had moments where I'd pull back, where the old fear of vulnerability would kick in, and I'd find excuses to cancel plans or keep conversations surface level. Marcus would notice, would give me space, but not too much space, would gently call me out when I was hiding. I can see you doing it, he said one evening when I'd been particularly distant. Building walls, trying to protect yourself. I don't know how not to, I admitted. This scares me, how much I care about you, how much it would hurt if you left. I'm not leaving, he said firmly, but I can't prove that to you with words. I can only show you day after day that I'm here, that I choose you, just like I chose to plant those pansies and the lavender and every other flower that made me think of you. Summer arrived, hot and bright, and the garden was in full bloom. The whole building had noticed the transformation. People actually used the courtyard now, sitting on the benches Marcus had installed, walking the paths he'd created, stopping to smell the flowers. The building manager had given him a bonus and a raise. Other buildings in the neighborhood had started asking about his services. You're going to be too successful for this place soon, I said one evening as we lay on my couch, my head on his chest, his fingers running through my hair. Maybe, he said, but I'll still keep this garden perfect. It's where I met you. You're such a romantic, I teased, but my voice was soft. Only for you, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. In August, on a night when the air was thick and warm and the garden was lit by string lights Marcus had hung the week before, he took me downstairs. The courtyard was empty, everyone else driven inside by the heat. But it was beautiful in the darkness, the flowers pale and ghostly, the smell of jasmine heavy in the air. I have something to show you, he said, leading me to my window, to the flower bed that had started everything. There, among the existing flowers, were new additions. White roses, their blooms perfect and luminous in the dim light. White roses, I said, my voice catching. Those are for true love, he finished. And new beginnings. I know we've only been together a few months, and I know you're still scared sometimes, and that's okay. But I wanted you to know that I'm serious about this, about us, about building something that lasts. I turned to face him, tears blurring my vision. I'm so bad at this, I said, at being open, at trusting, at believing that good things can stay. I know, he said gently, cupping my face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears on my cheeks. But you're getting better. Every day you're getting better. You're learning to let me in, and I'm patient. I'm so patient with you. Why? I asked. Why do you put up with all my walls and fears and defense mechanisms? He smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had first made my heart skip. Because you're worth it. Because underneath all that protection, you're kind and creative and funny and caring. Because you notice things, like flowers and beauty and effort. Because you make me want to create beautiful things just to see the look on your face when you discover them. I kissed him then, right there in the garden he'd built, under my window where he'd planted my favorite flowers, and it felt like something breaking open inside me, like years of carefully constructed walls crumbling, leaving me exposed but somehow safer than I'd ever been. I love you, I said against his lips, the words I'd been too afraid to say. I love you so much, it terrifies me. I love you too, he said, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to keep planting flowers for you and making you coffee and calling you out when you're hiding, and showing you every single day that you're worth staying for. We stood there for a long time, holding each other in the garden, surrounded by growing things and the promise of more growth to come. Above us, my window looked down like a witness to everything we'd built, everything we were still building. The seasons changed again. Fall brought chrysanthemums and asters. Winter brought evergreens and holly. Marcus started his own business in November, and I designed his logo and website. He hired 2 employees by January. We spent our first Christmas together, and then New Year's, and then Valentine's Day, where he presented me with a small pot containing a single pansy seedling. "For you to take care of," he said, "so you can practice nurturing something." I kept that pansy alive, against all odds, given my complete lack of gardening skills. Marcus coached me through it, patient and encouraging, celebrating when it bloomed like I'd accomplished something profound. And maybe I had. Maybe keeping that flower alive was proof that I could take care of something delicate and beautiful without destroying it. Spring came again, a full year since Marcus had first started working at my building, and the garden was more beautiful than ever. But the most beautiful thing was how I'd changed. How I'd learned to let someone love me, to accept care and attention without suspicion or fear. How I'd learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage. We were sitting on our bench, the one that had become ours through countless mornings and evenings spent there together, when Marcus said, "I have something to ask you." My heart jumped, but it wasn't fear this time. It was anticipation, hope. "My lease is up next month," he continued, "and I was thinking, maybe I don't renew it. Maybe I find somewhere else to live." My stomach dropped. "Oh." He must have seen my expression, because he quickly added, "With you. I mean, maybe I move in with you, if you want, if you're ready." The relief was dizzying. "You scared me for a second there." "Sorry," he said, taking my hand. "I'm not good at this romantic gesture thing, apparently." "You planted me a garden," I said. "You're excellent at romantic gestures." "So is that a yes?" I looked around at the garden he'd created, at the flowers he'd chosen specifically for me, at the beauty he'd brought into my life through patient, consistent care. I thought about how he'd taught me to trust, to open up, to believe that love could be gentle and steady instead of dramatic and fleeting. "Yes," I said. "Absolutely yes." He moved in 3 weeks later, bringing his jazz records and his gardening books and his patient, steady presence into my space. Our space now. It was an adjustment, learning to share my carefully controlled environment, but it was easier than I'd feared. Marcus had a way of fitting into my life without overwhelming it, of being present without being intrusive. The garden outside my window continued to bloom, season after season, a living testament to what happens when someone takes the time to really see you, to understand what you need, and to create beauty just because they can. Every morning I still stood at that window with my coffee, but now Marcus was usually beside me, his arm around my waist, both of us looking down at the garden that had brought us together. People ask me sometimes how we met, and I tell them about the flowers, about how he noticed what I loved and planted it where I'd see it every day, about how he taught me that love doesn't have to be loud or dramatic to be real, about how sometimes the most profound gesture is simply paying attention. I'm not afraid anymore, not of loving him, not of being loved, not of the vulnerability that comes with letting someone truly know you. Marcus taught me that, the same way he taught those neglected plants to bloom again, with patience, with care, with consistent attention to what was needed. The groundskeeper planted my favorite flowers outside my window, and in doing so, he planted something in me too: hope, trust, the belief that I was worth the effort, worth the care, worth staying for. And every morning when I look out at that garden, at the pansies and lavender and roses and all the other flowers he's planted over the months and years, I'm reminded that love, Real love is exactly like gardening. It takes time, attention, patience, and consistent care. But when you create the right conditions and put in the work, beautiful things grow.